And now to present our special program. This week, I believe that we will be bringing you an amazing and excellent lineup of lecturers who will bring you insights and appreciation, focusing on the theme, the people of Pakistan. Today's distinguished lecturer is Ambassador Akbar Ahmed, the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University, and one of the most important international voices on Islam today. He holds the first Distinguished Chair of Middle East and Islamic Studies at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He has taught at Princeton, Harvard, and Cambridge universities and has been called the world's leading authority on contemporary Islam by none less than the BBC. Dr. Ahmed was the Pakistan High Commissioner, Ambassador to the UK and Ireland. He is the author of over a dozen award-winning books, and I am pleased to tell you that he will be signing books right after this particular lecture. Most importantly for today's lecture, it is important that you know that Ambassador Akbar Ahmed has been in charge of the tribal region Waziristan, the mountainous region in northwest Pakistan that borders Afghanistan. It has been called the epicenter of the war on terror. The title of his lecture will be The Most Dangerous Place in the World, the Tribal Areas of Pakistan. We are grateful also today to Myra Baker Lowe and Catherine Lowe Hembry, and to their family fund for the support of this entire week's Interfaith Lecture Series. So now, let us give a warm welcome to Ambassador Akbar Ahmed.
Thank you, Joan. What an honor to be introduced by the legendary Joan Campbell herself. Thank you so much, Joan. My wife said as we were walking up to take off my warm coat. And I said, I'm not doing so the audience, my beloved audience, sweating out there in the heat will feel there's some jerk who's worse than us, so he's sweating. If he can tolerate it, so will we. So, in solidarity, I'm keeping it on. I would also like to thank Maureen and the Chautauqua Institute for organizing this very exciting week. It really is exciting. Pakistan is a much maligned, little understood, and a very important country, so I'm delighted that this is happening. I'm personally delighted that Zeenat, my wife, is here today with me, sitting behind me. And behind me, we have the glittering stars that you'll be hearing for the rest of the week. These are all very well-known personalities, including my personal guru, Karen Armstrong, sitting right behind us with all the rest. But I'm especially delighted to be back here and addressing you. I have always found the audiences, the community coming to these lectures to be a particularly sophisticated one, and I've always enjoyed interacting with you. So if you can help me make sense of the most dangerous place in the world, and by the way, I'm quoting President Obama on this, it'll help me a lot in my exercises in trying to explain this very difficult part of the world. My talk will be in 4 parts, so down to business. There will be an introduction, a conceptual frame. Secondly, I will describe the tribal areas. What are the tribal areas? Thirdly, I will talk about the way of life of the tribal areas, the code of honor that dominates that part of the world, the lineage structure. Finally, I will explore ways to move out of the current imbroglio, the current mess that is the tribal areas of Pakistan. So, for those of you who are taking notes, and I'm seeing some are diligently doing that, this is the time to start. We are into our introductory phase of the talk. I will base my talk on a new study, a new book that I'm working on, called The Thistle and the Drone. The thistle is for those of you who are fans of Tolstoy, from a novel called Haji Murad. Tolstoy in the 19th century is in the Caucasus Mountains, accompanying the Imperial Russian army, and he sees these tribesmen resisting central government control. They're fighting to maintain their sense of independence. And he describes them like the thistle. The thistle of those of you with a Scottish background, and I know many of you have Scottish-Irish backgrounds, you will remember that the thistle is the symbol, the emblem of Scotland itself. A proud, independent people, devoted to a sense of egalitarianism and independence. The tribes we are talking about are very similar. The drone, as you know, is a symbol of globalization, the 21st century. It's a new weapon. It's still a mystery. It is sleek, impersonal, lacks compassion. It's way up there somewhere, maybe watching us even now. Hope not going to strike us, at least for the next hour and a half. But that is the drone. It is something new. And these two are apt metaphors for the kind of society that we are living in today. The age of globalization, the thistle and the drone. And in this study, I've selected 50 tribal societies throughout the world and analyzed what's going on in these societies. The underlying thesis is that these societies have had major problems between the central government and the periphery, those tribes in the mountains and the deserts, for 1,000 years, or for 100 years, or for 200 years. After 9/11, they get caught up in the war on terror. And the United States, wittingly, unwittingly, willingly, unwillingly, knowingly, unknowingly, has got caught up in this very much localized confrontation. And you're seeing the results unfolding now. It's not over. We are just entering a phase of history. My focus today, of course, will be on Waziristan, and there'll be a Q&A, and I'll be happy to follow up anything that does not completely clarify things for you. As Joan said, I had the privilege of working as the chief administrator in these parts of Pakistan. I was political agent who's in charge, the civil administrator in charge of Waziristan, South Waziristan, and therefore I have some idea of the tribes and the terrain and a lot of respect for those people there. Now, I was in the audience at the White House when President Obama talked about the most dangerous place in the world, shortly after taking over, 2009. And I was very impressed. I said, finally, we have a clear-cut definition of a problem, and therefore, America is such a liberal, enlightened, civilized society, we will now have a solution. Don't laugh, please. So we have cause and effect. Now, unfortunately, it's been several years, and I'm not seeing a solution. And this concerns me a great deal. So, because I believe that this is now a situation that is like a forest fire and out of control, we really need to focus on this, and I'll explain why. Because Waziristan and the tribal areas are so critical to the region, and here's an important point for you. The tribal areas have historically not been important only to themselves. These are societies and tribes in play. This is a very important point I'm making. So please don't equate them, because when I talk to my American team of young researchers working with me and I say tribes, and they say, yes, professor, for us tribe means a John Wayne movie, it means Comanches, Sioux, and Apaches chasing cowboys down. I said, no, these are people who are very much in play today. They have entire countries named after them. Waziristan is the land of the Wazir tribe. Afghanistan is the land of the Afghan peoples, the Pushtun, the Pathans. Balochistan, the land of the Baloch. Saudi Arabia, named after the Saud tribe. So, very modestly, they named the whole peninsula after their own tribe. They just say, call the whole damn thing Saudi Arabia. But that's how these tribes function. To them, that is their universe. And they are in play today. This is a very important point. Now, what happens in the tribal areas does not stay in the tribal areas. It has an impact way beyond into Kabul, Afghanistan. There have been kingmakers in history. They have an impact on Islamabad, Pakistan, beyond to Delhi, and now Washington. So these tribal areas are in play. You will hear again and again American presidents and generals saying Pakistan must do more. Pakistan must control the Haqqani group. The Haqqani group are based in North Waziristan because they belong to a certain tribe that is related to the Wazir tribe. So here's where we become tribal in our discussion. In these areas, you will also have foreign powers fishing in troubled waters. China, India, Iran, Russia, they're all fishing in these troubled waters, the tribal areas of Pakistan. And Pakistan, because this is part of Pakistan, has taken the brunt. Pakistan has had something like 30,000 Pakistanis dead, killed, as a result of the events after 9/11. Of these, something like 10,000 may be Pakistani soldiers in fighting the Taliban and the elements in the tribal areas. And Pakistanis will say, we had nothing to do with 9/11. We've lost 30,000 people. The officer-soldier ratio is the highest in the world. We have more troops in the field today than all of NATO combined. And the blowback is that the TTP are now striking in Karachi, in Lahore, in the big cities. They're walking into schools, they're walking into buses, they're walking into mosques, into churches, and blowing themselves up. So Pakistan, the fabric of Pakistan, is now being shred from something that we have no control over and was not our problem. So Pakistan is in a very difficult quandary, how to proceed ahead with this. And again, it all goes back to the tribal areas. Now, as if this wasn't complicated enough, the fog of war, you know the cliche, the fog of war, is particularly dense and heavy over this particular war on terror. Allies don't trust each other. Allies spend more time in undermining each other than the enemy. Take Pakistan and the United States. The United States thinks Pakistan is duplicitous. It is incompetent. It deceives the United States in spite of all the generous aid it gets. After the killing of OBL, relations deteriorated even more rapidly than expected. And Richard Clarke, a very senior statesman of the United States, I heard him on the Bill Maher show actually saying that Pakistanis, all Pakistanis, are pathological liars. With the exception of these very distinguished people. We don't want this lot walking out right now. They've already been agitated by the morning session, and we'll talk about that. So here we have one of the most distinguished Americans actually saying this of an entire nation. And what about the nation? Here's what Pakistanis, who traditionally are friends of the United States, for the last half century, Pakistan and the United States have been on the same side. Important point to keep in mind. Pakistanis believe all kinds of wild things about the United States today in this environment. Some believe that the floods in Pakistan were caused by the United States. Some believe that the civilian plane that crashed, killing hundreds of passengers on board, was organized by the United States. The aim was to fly it into the nuclear program of Pakistan, nuclear reactors. So you can see that the fog of war is not helping at all. And in the meantime, the tribal areas are in flames. No one is actually able to give us any idea of how to deal with it. So let us take a closer look at the tribal areas. The tribal areas were an administrative arrangement designed by the British in the 19th century. They were moving up India, irresistible. They crossed the river Indus on their way to Afghanistan, and it took them half a century to come up with the idea of a special administration for the tribes. And here's where I want you to start thinking. The British are the superpower of the 19th century. They are the greatest power on earth. The sun never sets on the British Empire. Nothing can stand in their way. And they march into Afghanistan, the great army of the Indus. It was called that, the Grand Army of the Indus. Nothing can stand in front of it. And do you know what happens a few months later? You tell me what happens. They were wiped out. Except one man. Oh, one man. Dr. Bryden, very famous man because he becomes immortal. Dr. Bryden turns up in Jalalabad, famous now because of the war on terror in Afghanistan. Outside the garrison, one man, shoulder blade blown up, skull half shattered, horse about to die, all alone. And when the sentries on duty cannot believe their eyes and they say, "Sir, what happened to the army of the Indus?" And he says, "I am all that is left." So at the high noon of the British Empire, an entire army has disappeared. These are the Pakhtun tribes. The Afghans have never been defeated in history. They destroy themselves, you blow up their villages, destroy their families, but they are very much like the Americans. They believe in independence, in freedom, and they'll give their lives for that. This is what they believe, rightly or wrongly. Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, the British, the Soviets, everyone has been and tried this. So the British said, practical people, they said this won't do. Took them a couple of decades, but they said, we are going to create these tribal areas and we are going to administer these areas through the designated officer called the political agent. Now, when you say agent, you think of CIA and FBI and so on. No, this is the civil service. This is the elite of the British civil service. He's called political agent because he's agent to the Governor General of India, the highest official in India. And the political agent at a very young age has enormous powers. He speaks the language. He understands the customs. He's hand-picked. And Waziristan was the pick of the pick. And why was Waziristan difficult? Let's take a look. The mountains, the terrain, and the two toughest tribes of the tribal areas, the Wazir and the Masood. Absolutely ferocious fighting forces. At one stage, in the 1930s, there were more troops in Waziristan alone than the rest of the Indian subcontinent put together. In the 1930s, they did what the Afghans had done to the British army. They wiped out an entire British brigade. And the British couldn't understand this. A brigade marched in and disappeared. This is what they had done. And Lord Curzon, possibly the most brilliant of the viceroys of India, was so exasperated and he said, Waziristan, it's beyond control. What they need is the steamroller, a steamroller to go from one end to the other end to completely crush them. But I will not be the man to start the steamroller. That's Lord Curzon, a brilliant man, Oxford, and with that very erudite background. So this is the background of Waziristan. Now, because of this background, you will understand that from Waziristan comes the most ferocious, the most violent of the mutations of the Taliban. And that is the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP. And they really they crossed every red line. They blow up schools, they blow up each other, they blow up their cousins, the Wazir, and it really is now a herald of something new happening in the tribal areas. This kind of warfare is unprecedented in the tribal areas. And you then have the drones. There have been more drone strikes in Waziristan than anywhere on this planet. So today, literally, you have a drone strike every second day, today, tomorrow, day after. Now, there's a big debate about drones. I'm writing this book, so I've had to research on this. And believe me, the jury's out. We are told that only militants are killed. The facts are that David Kilcullen, the greatest authority on the advisor to General Petraeus, look him up, Colonel David Kilcullen, he's the advisor to the American Army, very distinguished. David said that only 2% are the intended targets. Only 2%. 98% could be you, me, we're sitting with someone and a drone strike and you're all blown up. The question is, the decision, the judgment, the trial process, all that is set aside. And when people are killed, they're all labeled militant. That's also an aspect of the drone. Now, in retrospect, you say, well, all these guys were militants because they were with the militants. We don't know the process. What we don't discuss and this is why I talked about the age of globalization, is that the very nature of the drone has traumatized an entire society. Those people have men and women and children just like you and me. They're ordinary human beings. Some of them, yes, are involved in all kinds of activities, but you go after them. I was in charge. I had to deal with people like this. Murderers, hostage takers, people breaking the law, and we went after them. Bushra's father, Colonel Ali Gohar, was a distinguished colleague in charge of the scouts there. He had to go and maintain law and order. But the drone is something entirely different. And the reports coming from that area are that that drone is completely traumatizing the next generation. And this is how they describe it. They say, day and night, you hear this buzzing. It's like the angel of death. And you don't know when it's coming. You don't know where it's going to land, who's going to be taken out. Now, we may say, well, that's all very well, but these guys have terrorists amongst them. Well, they don't, because they are being terrorized by those terrorists. We have to, certainly the government of Pakistan has to ensure that there is stability and law and order in those areas. It is because of that failure that the United States is getting bogged down there, the tribesmen are suffering, and Pakistan itself now faces this predicament. So the people of that area will tell you this. They will say one day a drone will arrive and kill us. Next day the Pakistan army will have some action and blow up things and use helicopter gunships and so on. The third day, some suicide bomber will come and blow himself up, killing women and children. Fourth day, there may be a tribal warfare going on which will involve them. Men are running away with their wives and their kids. They're just taking them out and they're turning up in Karachi and Lahore, in the bigger cities, living in shanty towns on the plains as destitute refugees. And these are impoverished people. Even in my time, there was very little real development there. They say every day is like 9/11 for us. And when you tell them, terrorists amongst you, they'll say, what are you talking about? We are the victims of these terrorists. We are the first victims. Our homes are being destroyed. And no one sympathizes with us. Neither the Pakistanis, nor the Americans, nor our own chiefs. And talking of chiefs, let's have a quick look at the structure of that area. Now, tribal society in the tribal areas, and these are possibly the nearest thing we have to tribal societies, these are very biblical in that sense, had three sources of authority. The first source of authority was the traditional leader. His source of authority rested in the lineage. The person who could say, my father, grandfather, 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 going right back to the founder of the tribe. That gave him the authority. It also meant that the elder had to preserve and maintain the customs of the land, maintain hospitality, show extra courage, show guidance. These are fiercely independent people. So even the elder did not have that kind of authority that you would see in the plains. These were people who would be challenged, they have to prove their leadership qualities. But in the council of elders in the Jirga, which was a council like the ancient Greeks, they would meet in a place like this and discuss and come up with a decision. That's traditional leadership. Their tribal charter is a very interesting one. The Pathans, I'm talking now of the tribal areas, these are Pathan tribes, Pakhtun tribes. They claim descent from Afghana, hence the name Afghan, hence the name Afghanistan, as I said. Afghana, they say, in their mythology, was a daughter of King Saul. And they claim, like many other peoples of the world, that they are a lost tribe of Israel. And very few people know this. If you look at them, as an anthropologist was fascinated, I in fact wrote a paper on this with Professor Ernest Gellner, the great anthropologist from England. We were fascinated with this link, the Semitic link, if you like. If you look at their features, the way they carried themselves, the dignity, the poise, you really got a sense that, my God, if there was a translation of a biblical character straight out, this is what it would look like. Very impressive. They speak with sobriety. They speak with confidence, tremendous sense of humor. They will not be easily swayed. They want balance in society. And as I said, these tribes have given their names to that region for centuries. Their world is now upside down. Because the TTP, the men of violence, have understood that to undermine and destroy society, you attack the head. So the elders of that area have been targeted. And these are very small populated tribes. And in total, you may have something like 800 elders or 900 elders of the entire region. Do you know that 800 elders have been assassinated over the last few years? Now, for a small community, we are not talking of huge populations like Karachi or Lahore. We are talking of small tribes, a couple of 100,000 people. A tribal elder represents the entire tribe. And it takes years to produce that kind of maturity and balance and impressiveness. One assassination and it's gone. The tribe is headless, or as anthropologists say, acephalous. There is no head. That's what the TTP have done. So in Waziristan alone from my time, 400 elders have been finished, assassinated. That's your first pillar. So the first pillar is now broken. It's almost demolished. Second pillar was religious leadership. Religious leadership, again, I want to emphasize this, in the West, we think of Islam, we think of religious leadership, and we think of crazy fanatics wanting to behead someone or be violent. Religious leadership in the tribal areas, by definition, has to play a passive role. Otherwise, there is no role for them. When the tribes are fighting, and they often fight, this is called typical cousin rivalry, they're fighting, everyone is equal. And this again is biblical. Everyone, Cain, Abel, we are both equal, so who gives you any authority more than me? That's how the tribes are. Who adjudicates between them? Who is the judge between them? It is the religious leader. So the job of the religious leader is to make sure that there is peace and there's calm in that society. Guess what? That's the second pillar attacked by the TTP. So all the religious leadership who traditionally had some authority have also been now targeted. So the TTP will come and say, we are now the religious leaders. We will tell you what Islam is. So Baitullah Masood, one of the founding members of the TTP, in fact, was notorious for this. He called himself the Amir, the leader, the Islamic leader of his people. Now, understanding this tribal structure, you can imagine that no traditional elder, no religious leader would accept someone like him. The third pillar is, of course, the central government and the political agent. The political agent representing all the services of Pakistan or the central government. That is health, education, roads, all these which he would coordinate. And they would work together in unison. I've already described the political agent, that in the old days he was described as half ambassador, half governor. He had tremendous authority, and that was largely British. In Pakistan, Pakistan is an independent country. Pakistan has to now evolve and adjust this role if it has to revive it at all. The old draconian laws have to change. An element of representation must come in. Ordinary tribal people must be given representation. All that is overdue. But until the structure is put back, today you have no structure. And now please try to understand, because you are involved. The United States is there. The United States is very much involved. It's got to resolve this, because if it doesn't, its flank, its weakness is the Waziristan area, which is exposing its flank in eastern Afghanistan. The Haqqani group cross back. The Americans put pressure on Pakistan. Pakistan sends troops in, more drones, more fighting, more killing. Nothing is being solved. So try to understand the equation. unless you put Humpty Dumpty back together, which is always a difficult task. Once he falls off, it's difficult to put him together. But unless you do, nothing will work. Because right now, you have no structure. So what you have in this vacuum is the military, the general, the GOC. The GOC now runs the shots. So when he calls the shots, the political agent is marginalized. The tribal elder is marginalized, and everyone knows now the general has the authority. There may be a civilian government, but it is the man in the field with the troops, as Napoleon often reminded us. If you have 50,000 troops under you, no one's going to challenge you. They have the money, they have the guns, they have the authority. But they are not trained to deal with the tribes. Even the British, who were colonials, foreigners and so on, they would come here, they would learn the language. One of my predecessors was a man called Sir Evelyn Howell. Remarkable man, remarkable man. And let me just go off in a tangent and tell you a little bit about him to tell you the caliber of the people. Now this is the elite of the elite. Howell, educated at Cambridge, was in Cambridge in 1965 when I met him. He had about 3 years to live, and he would die after that. I was a young student at Cambridge. I had no idea who he was. Years later, when I became political agent, I read the monograph that he had written on Waziristan. Until today, it's probably one of the finest pieces of writing on tribal society. This is an Englishman writing about Waziristan. He spoke the language. When he invited me for tea, he was translating the great Pashto poet Khushal Khan Khattak. He was in fact translating him into English, and he absolutely loved that culture. So Olaf Karo, again I had the privilege of being friends, and Zinat's grandfather, the Wali of Swat, was a great friend of his. Karo described the Pathans in terms of love. He said, these are the finest people on earth. They're like the Scots. They're completely like the Scots. Their independence, their pride, their dignity, and he just raved about them. And he wrote a book called The Pathans, which is a sort of classic book. He talks of them as the quintessential Athenian Greek society. These are the people we are dealing with. And unless we have some idea of their background, their culture, their history, how are we going to deal with them? And this complaint, this observation I have, is not confined to an American audience which is not expected to know about these people. It is also addressed to the Pakistanis. Because I found that very often the Pakistanis who are running Pakistan, the big shots, the generals, the civil servants, are very often from an urban-based background, either Karachi or Lahore. And instinctively, culturally, politically, they have little sympathy with the peoples of Balochistan or the tribal areas. They will just dismiss them. They will say, these are primitive people. These are not like us. And I recall my talking to these tribesmen and saying, why don't you want Pakistan's police and revenue officials here to deal with your problems? And they would laugh, the great sense of humor. They would say, are you serious? You want the most corrupt police in the world to come and deal with us? Don't you think we have enough problems? And that made me think a lot. I said, my God, this is how people look at us. So Pakistan has problems. It has to deal with this. It can't keep postponing at this. Yes, foreign powers are fishing in troubled waters, as I said. There's no doubt about it. In Balochistan, tribal areas, people will take advantage. But Pakistan has to devise a way to deal with this problem of its own making. Finally, in terms of the tribe, let me talk about something peculiar to the Pathans, and that is called Pushtun Wali, the way of the Pathans. Now, this is a mythological charter of how Pathans behave. And this is common to all tribal societies. If you talk to a Scotsman, maybe your granddads who came originally from Scotland, they will talk about the code of honor, of hospitality, of courage, of revenge. Revenge is a very important part of this. So they will say, there's a famous Pathan saying, I took revenge after 100 years and I took it too soon. So they pass it on generation to generation. Why? Because they say this is honor involved. And it is very regulated. It's a chivalric code. You don't just go and kill women and children. Someone kills someone, in reaction, someone will then take an action. It's almost symmetrical. But what's happening today with the TTP as they walk into a school or a mosque or a church and just blow up everyone is a negation of this code of honor. This is an important point I'm making in terms of the code. So you're seeing this kind of devastation taking place in Karachi, in Lahore, and tribesmen will tell you commonly that all this began after 9/11 when President Musharraf ordered the army under pressure from the United States, not understanding what's going on. So the United States said, you guys better control the tribes. These are your areas, control them, or we'll put pressure on you. So instead of controlling the tribal areas, internally, Musharraf just used the steamroller, which Lord Curzon was not prepared to do. He sent in 100,000 troops or 50,000 troops, and that began the present cycle of violence, which hasn't quite ended. He also killed Nawab Bukti, one of the top Baloch chiefs. And with that, he opened up a front in Balochistan. And there's a simmering civil war situation, which is still continuing today. So he was opening up two fronts, Balochistan and the tribal areas. And as any military commander, including Napoleon Bonaparte, will tell you, you cannot fight a war on two fronts at the same time. You just can't. The general must focus on one front. Musharraf had opened up two fronts. As if this wasn't enough, he demolished the administrative structure that held Pakistan. So he demolished the commissioner, deputy commissioner, this whole political agent structure. It remained, but it was watered down without much authority, and it became ineffective. When he needed it most, because a storm was coming to Pakistan, and that storm had to be stopped internally, not from outside. And Pakistan was not able to cope because of that. And then, if you recall, there was that attack on the mosque in Islamabad, the Red Mosque. Now, with that attack, of course, for tribesmen, Musharraf had crossed the final red line. They said he's anti-tribal, he's anti-Pakistan, he's anti-Islam, he's killing women and children in a mosque, which happened. Several hundred girls were killed, a lot of them from the frontier. And this began a very vicious cycle of revenge within Pakistan. So you're seeing this evolution of the war on terror. America's in Afghanistan fighting a war on terror. In the meantime, a very different war is evolving in Pakistan itself. And I've described it in detail to tell you how it evolved. So today we have a situation where the TTP are involved in revenge attacks against the Pakistan army. The Pakistan army is involved in trying to crush them physically. Without the old structures, without the traditional leadership, the religious leadership, and the political administration, it cannot be held together. That's where you are at today. And the Americans are now involved and have no idea how to proceed. They just don't know how to move. So they'll tell you, Islamabad, you're not doing enough, we're going to put more pressure on you. Islamabad will say, we are doing enough. They might put more pressure, so they'll send more troops in, and it'll get even worse. So please try to understand how complicated it is. Now, let's move towards the last part of my talk, and I'll try to draw in the strands, and then we'll have our Q&A. So if you were to look at the history of the tribal areas, the most dangerous place in the world, I would sum it up like this. I would say 1,000 years of independence, more or less left alone. Every conqueror in history who's gone through their areas into India has had to acknowledge them, including Alexander. Alexander had to bribe the tribes to go through the Khyber Pass. The great Mughals who made the Taj Mahal. The emperor who made the Taj Mahal, as you know, is Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan's son, Aurangzeb, sent an army into these areas. And guess what? It was what they did to the British. The entire Mughal army was destroyed, except they always leave one person to go and tell the story. That was the governor of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was then part of the Mughal Empire. Now, it would have been much cheaper to do what Alexander did. And that's why Alexander is such a brilliant general. He is a brilliant general on the battlefield, but he's also brilliant off the battlefield. Because he knows that warfare is simply an extension of politics. If he has to achieve an end, warfare is just one means to that end, not an end in itself. And that's what he would do. He'd fight someone, then make up with them, go on and carry on into the next country. So, I'm making this point because for 1,000 years they were left alone. And they lived on their own with their own tribes and their own codes and their own elders. Then the British came, colonization, and they had a century of semi-independence. Tribal areas, but they were left alone. The British respected that. In that, unfortunately, they fell back. So, hospitals, colleges, schools. When I went to Waziristan, literally there were no major colleges or hospitals for the tribes. And again, Pakistan failed them. Pakistan should have delivered this to them after independence. They were part of Pakistan. And then we have the last decade, post 9/11. So, 1,000 years of independence, 1 century of more or less being left alone, and 1 decade of sheer hell. It's hell on earth right now in the tribal areas. It's total uncertainty, total chaos, total violence, and with no control. I talk to Pakistanis, and they will say, well, what can we do? There are foreign powers interfering. And when they say, Pakistanis say foreign powers, you know who they mean. In case you're confused, it's not India anymore. How much more subtle can I be? When you talk to Americans, for this book, I've interviewed lots of Americans, very senior officers, Army, State Department. They will say Pakistan's behind the violence. They're engineering this. So there's such gaps in our understanding of what is happening in the last decade, and that is impacting the tribal areas. Because it is so crucial for the United States to come out of this with a semblance of victory. And I believe this because I'm a scholar of that area. It is crucial because this touches on what once was called the Great Game. The Great Game, as you know, was something played by the great imperial powers in the 19th century between the British, the Russians, and the Chinese. Today you have a 21st century version of the Great Game, which means it's confused, you don't know who's doing what to whom, and you don't really know the objectives. But players are there in the field. Now, in this great game, the United States cannot simply pack up, however much it may be fed up, however much it wants to come home from that region. It is stuck. It's not a happy marriage, but they're stuck. Why? Because that area is the heart of Asia. Just think of the region we are talking about, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia. On the one side, China. In the south, India. To the north, Russia and the Central Asian states. To the west, Iran and Arabia, the Arab states. Can the United States just pack up and leave? And leave this huge vacuum? Already the foreign powers are there, and they would like nothing better than the United States to leave. So it is in the interest of the United States to be there. If it is in their interest to be there, then it must win this war. And if it must win this war, it must win it not necessarily on the battlefield, but learn from history. Learn from the British political agents who won these wars not through military might, through diplomacy, through culture, through tribal customs. So that in the end, even up to my time when I talked to these tribal elders, they would very often say, we admired the British. We fought them, but we admired them. They were men of honor. They were men of their word. And they did not interfere with our tribal customs and our tribal politics. They stayed aloof, which was a fact. The British just left them on their own. Now, unfortunately, the Americans have gone in there with what I think is probably the greatest army in human history. The American Army is a magnificent, its training of soldiers, the equipment, the weapons, the motivations. I've had the privilege of addressing the Pentagon. I'm associated with the US Naval Academy. These are really the finest of the fine. And they're the ones who give their lives for this country. They're the ones who are in the front line. And we really owe them a lot, because without thinking, they'll go and fight for all of us. And yet, what have we done to this army? I want you to pause and think about this. It's not very pleasant, but think about this. In the longest war in American history, this Afghan war is the longest war in American history. Colin Powell, a man of some credibility, described the American army, I'm quoting him now, as broken. Suicide rates are hitting now 1 a day. 1 a day. There are more suicide deaths than the Taliban have killed Americans. Now, to me, as a scholar of history, this is shocking. It's unacceptable. I think back of Alexander, and I said, why don't these generals read history in this area? I'm serious about this. Alexander arrives in India and he fights the king of India. It's a very famous incident in history. On the banks of the river Jhelum, where Pakistan is now, he defeats the king, King Porus. And he is brought, King Porus, it's a very fierce battle. The Greeks have lost a lot of men. They've been marching for years. They're fed up. They're tired. They're telling Alexander, we want to go home. We miss our families. So they vent their fury on King Porus. And they say, kill this man. Torture him and kill him. So Porus is brought before Alexander. Alexander's sitting on his throne. And Porus is in chains. And Alexander asks King Porus, King Porus, how do you want to be treated? And King Porus replies, like a king. Alexander, now he could have done several things. He could have said, off to the torture chambers, bring out the waterboarding. Or he could have said, I will treat you differently, I'll try you. Or he could have said what he said. This is Alexander. He said, you will be treated like a king. Come and sit with me. He put King Porus next to himself, and he said, from today, King Porus will represent me in this region. And I'm attaching these regions to his kingdom. Overnight, the biggest enemy of King Alexander became his greatest ally. What has he done in history? So I'm quoting history for us to be thinking of ways to come out on top of a very bad situation. It's pointless my saying it's wonderful, it'll all be fine, it'll be excellent, we'll all somehow emerge victorious, because in the end, what will victory look like? What will it look like? What are the costs? We have emerging powers, China, India, Russia. We are in debt to one of them. We are competing with them on so many levels. This is the time we need our boys in uniform more than ever in history. This is the time when I've quoted Colin Powell to you. And it all goes back to the tribal areas. So I'm trying to, as a professor, connect the dots for you. These are difficult dots to connect, but I'm connecting for you. I'm also pointing out that in these areas, you need to be doing several things. You need to be thinking of education. The education of the tribal areas is appalling. The statistics are shocking. For men, it's something like 5%. For women, it's 0%. You cannot have a society in the 21st century and expect women to be leading it and educating their kids and holding it together when they are being bombed and blown up and killed, and there's zero education. So Pakistan has to give emphasis to education. Pakistan must help people understand the history and culture of the tribal peoples. It must help its American allies understand the history and culture, and must understand it itself. Pakistan and America must repair their very unhappy relationship. It is a relationship that is important to both countries, however brittle and unpleasant it is right now. Both need each other. It is in the interest of Pakistan, not just for the aid, but because Pakistanis have by and large wanted democracy, They want a healthy, stable society, and they have admiration for the Americans. It's a tragedy what is happening today. And let me confirm this for you. In my last book, Journey into America, I reproduced a picture. And as Americans, I want you to ponder this picture. It should make you proud. There's a picture of Jackie Kennedy in 1962 in Lahore, in Pakistan, in a car, standing side by side with the President of Pakistan. And Jackie is beautifully dressed, elegantly dressed. She's a beautiful woman. And the President of Pakistan is a very handsome man. They're standing together, waving to the crowds. And there are hundreds of Pakistanis around them, smiling, beaming, and throwing flowers at them. Think of this image that I've just said to you. She then goes to the tribal areas. Think of it, the tribal areas of Pakistan, the ones we are talking about. And the tribesmen go crazy about her. They're slaughtering, not Americans, they're slaughtering cows and goats and sheep in honor of Jackie. Think of it, here is Jackie Kennedy, First Lady of the United States, being honored by the tribesmen. The challenge we have today in America is which America is being seen in Pakistan. Is it the America which was loved, where people are throwing flowers at them, or is it the America today where there's so much unpleasantness between both countries? I would like to see a relationship which is healthy, attractive, and amiable between the two countries. Pakistan has to learn so much from America. Democracy, civil liberties, human rights, the vision of the founding fathers. These are lessons that every Pakistani would appreciate. And they need to learn these lessons. And we can learn so much from an ally in that very difficult part of the world. The stronger and the more stable Pakistan is, the stronger this relationship. The more we push Pakistan, and I've given you the structure without, like a doctor, like a surgeon, without sweetening the pill, as it were, the more you shake this rather shaky structure, it's going to end up badly for all of us. You know, if you're in this hall and these pillars are beginning to shake, we all will be hit by it, not just me or you. The whole lot, all of us will be affected. That is Pakistan's situation. Unfortunately, the people in power in Pakistan or the United States don't seem to fully understand this. We also need to understand that in the tribal areas, without long-term planning, strategic planning, bringing back some of these old structures, suitably adjusted, democracy, different powers for the elders, different powers for the political administrators, we cannot begin the process of putting things together. And finally, I will end. Joan, how much time do I have?
If we end by 3 o'clock, about 7 more minutes.
7 more minutes, that's perfect. I will end with one story and then be happy to answer any questions that you may have. This story is about a man called Safar Khan. Not important to you, no one's heard of him. In my time when I was political agent, Safar Khan was like Osama bin Laden. He was kidnapping people, he was shooting officers of the army, and he would slip across the border into Afghanistan, between the tribes, brilliantly. He's a brilliant chess player. So I couldn't get hold of him. I'm this side of the border, he's crossed into Afghanistan. When I'd contact the Afghan officials, they'd put pressure, he'd go into Balochistan. Now, the Inspector General of the Balochistan Scouts rang me, very irate, very upset, and he said, Akbar, this Safar Khan has just kidnapped a Lance Naik, that's a senior officer of the Balochistan Scouts. He's just come here, kidnapped him, and taken him into your territory. So I said, let me check up. He said, if you don't recover him, I'm bringing my troops. Now, I do not believe in military force. As a political officer, if I cannot succeed and I bring in the military, I have failed. By definition, I failed. That's how we were set up. I should use every pressure. I have the army behind me. The political agent had the scouts, his own scouts, Waziristan scouts. I have the force, I have my own troops, the Khasidars, 4,000 men under me with guns. I'm not going to use them. I'm going to use my political skills. So I said, you hold off, let me deal with him. And I often thought of this case when President Bush was after OBL. He had the same problem. OBL was hiding in the same tribes, same areas, and he would be moving around, difficult to get hold of. So how did we recover Zafar Khan? We recovered him through my using the 3 pillars. I mobilized the tribal elders. All kinds of pressures were put on them, the carrot and the stick. But I said, you guys are responsible. Either I allow the army to go in, and then don't blame me, because the army only uses force. They'll use force. Or you bring him in, number 1. Number 2, I got the religious leaders. And I said, your role as religious leaders is to ensure peace. And you cannot have people kidnapping anyone, forget soldiers. And thirdly, I mobilized my own resources as political agent. Now, after several weeks of very difficult maneuvering, we got him and we recovered him. Now, this was a huge incident in our part of the world. Zafar Khan was literally the biggest name in terms of outlaws and terrorists and bandits. And he came in on the condition. I gave him a condition. He said, I will not come in until I'm assured that there'll be justice. I don't want someone to shoot me like a dog. And I said, the people of Balochistan guarantee that you will be tried under tribal custom. The elders will try you according to your custom. And that's fair. That's how things are done in the tribal areas. So he came in with the guarantee that he would be tried, and he was tried, and he was suitably punished. My point is that we have 2 ways of doing things. There's a culture and there's a society. It has its own rhythm, its own rules, its own patterns. It helps a lot if we understand that. I wish my Pakistani colleagues in Islamabad understood the tribal areas better than they do. Things would not have been so bad for them. They can become worse if they don't very quickly begin to understand them. The British took half a century to understand them. And in the end, they had a relatively easy time. Not all that easy. There was always danger, but a relatively easier time than they would have otherwise had. And in case you think that I'm simply pointing out the British, remember in the 19th century you had colonization taking place all across the world. And what was happening in Africa and other parts compared to the British was really complete brutality. So the colonial powers had very little patience with Africans or Asians compared to the British. I will end by giving you 3 books in case you're interested to learn a little bit about the tribal areas. There's a book by Sir Olaf Karo, which I mentioned, called The Pathans. Famous book, it's a classic. There's a book by Sir Evelyn Howell. Small book, a little gem called Mij, M-I-Z-H. Mij is the Waziristan word for we, literally meaning us. And then my own book on Waziristan is called Resistance and Control in Pakistan. So with that, let me thank you for patiently listening to me, and thank you for organizing this. Thank you.
Now we have a time, about 15 minutes for questions, and I invite you to come to the microphones, and we'll go from one to the other. Let's begin over here.
Thank you for that enlightening talk. Steven Pinker, in his book,
Who's this?
Steven Pinker, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, shows pretty conclusively of a steady decline in violent deaths over the past number of centuries. And he says that the most important one of those was bringing people under central government control so that they control the power to punish rather than the kinds of things that you see in tribal warfare. But part of the trade-off is then that they have to provide the services that you've been talking about. So how do we aid Pakistan in providing those kinds of services, the education you were talking about, and whatever, without just pouring money down a rat hole, which seems to be what we have done so far?
I think this is an excellent question. And in fact, you've pinpointed the predicament of all central governments. Absolutely right. How much do you invest in the tribal areas or the periphery without, in fact, compromising their integrity and your own? Central government has to have a writ. And this is the dilemma faced by not only Pakistan, but all countries with a periphery. All countries have this problem. With India, you have problems with the Kashmiris. 60 years after independence, you still have a simmering situation. With the Nagas, with so many peripheral in China, you have problems with the Mongolians, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans. How much do you invest, and then how much do you compromise there? And I think this really has to be worked out between both the center and the periphery. It's easy to tilt to one or the other. Now, having said this, I don't entirely agree with Mr. What was his name?
Steven Pinker.
Steven Pinker. When he says in the last few centuries there's been peace and the graph has been going down. I don't know which world he's living in, because according to my understanding of history, the 20th century has probably been one of the bloodiest centuries in terms of precisely the modern state fighting each other. Germany fighting the rest of Europe, Russia, the Soviet Union, and millions are killed. Now, if you add up those numbers, and again, I haven't conducted a study, we have the authority sitting here, Karen Armstrong, but if you were to add up, I'm told that the Second World War, how many people died, Karen? Must be what, 30, 40, 50 million?
50 million.
40, 50, how many?
50.
50 million. How many did Stalin kill in the Soviet Union? They've been killing on that scale, which I would have thought overshadowed anything in the past. I would say that the graph has moved up in the 20th century, and hopefully it'll go down. What the drones are doing is, thankfully, not many numbers are being killed. So, it may be 10, 15, 20. It's more psychological. But in terms of numbers, I would say the 20th century is a really bad century.
Well, if you put it in terms of on a per population basis, there were more people killed in World War II, but there were more people. So I understand.
Okay, thank you. Terrific comments and speech, rather. I think I learned a lot today. But the main thing I took away is that the primary culprit in the problems in the tribal areas are really the TTP or the Taliban that are really upsetting it. It's not really the United States. We're there primarily to help our forces in Afghanistan and help get cargo and ammunition to support our troops. So once we leave Afghanistan, why not just pull out of Afghanistan, pull out of Pakistan? Maybe the drones aren't perfect. We still can do drones here to do what we have to do, stop our aid to Pakistan and go home.
Now, this is, of course, a good, neat suggestion. I've been trying to argue against it because the United States has to be involved for its own strategic interests, its national interest. If the United States, and it's a superpower, it's a player on the world stage, it cannot afford to leave such a huge strategic part of the world unprotected to its own interests. So it will be there in one form or the other. Now, if it's there, it needs friends. It cannot be there with the whole population up in arms against it. And I don't think there's anyone better to answer you than one of the leading members of parliament from Pakistan. So this is not part of her talk, but I'll request her to answer this also. Come along, Bushra.
Goodness. I think it's more complex, and we have to see the situation in a more, it's not black and white, okay, we can move out. I don't believe that the whole problem is just the TTP. And that is why I feel that it would be better if tomorrow afternoon, when I speak and I give you my perspective of it, because I personally feel that there is a history. The United States has certain responsibility, not really the strategic, but a certain responsibility to take in the region because of the kind of problems that we are faced with there. So I think that it is better that we leave it here. I may not agree that it is as simple as the way you put it, but we can actually debate and discuss it tomorrow when I give you my perspective on the whole thing.
Thank you. I'll be back.
Yes.
So please come tomorrow, okay?
Yes, exactly. Great advertisement, yes.
I also agree that we can't leave a power vacuum in Central Asia. But what I want to know is, how do we proceed? In my view, it's largely about protecting the civilian population and ensuring their security first and foremost as a mission objective, before you're able to move into establishing an elder relation, a tribal elder, a religious pillar, and the political pillar. I'm curious to know your thoughts on a strategy for arriving at having those three pillars
No,
reformed.
I appreciate that point, but you've got to again ask yourself this. Why are we taking it upon ourselves to protect the Afghan population? What have we got to do with them? Why is it your job or my job?
The Waziristan population?
No, I'm talking about Afghanistan or the tribal areas. Isn't the responsibility primarily up to the government in Kabul or the government in Islamabad?
Well, I think there's a disassociation between the effectiveness of the central governments and their span of control into those areas. I mean, you mentioned that Waziristan was an ungovernable space, mostly because they had an aversion to central government authority. I think the same can be said for Afghanistan. So, the question is, how do we balance that relationship between a centralized government authority that's not being accepted by the local leadership and trying to promote the establishment of a nation state?
I think we can help a great deal through education, through targeted aid. By that I mean, again, educational institutions. Let me give you the example, again, live example from my own background. The Foreman Christian College in Lahore, American college run by Presbyterians. I was there, privileged to be at the college, and again, it's produced prime ministers and foreign ministers and members of parliament, 2 presidents, contemporaries of mine. Now, why can't we give that kind of aid? Mm-hmm. Rather than get involved in politics and tribal politics, which we really don't know very much about, and which will end badly for us. Because we'll get fed up and then the reaction is, let's walk out. That'll be the next reaction. In order for us to be effective, we need to be designing the kinds of aid that we can, and which will be appreciated. Believe me, every Pakistani, whatever his politics, loves the idea of educating their kids. Ask men or women. Their complaint is we don't have enough schools, enough teachers, enough programs, enough exchange programs, computers. Give them aid that they will appreciate and thank you for. Foreman Christian College has really, I've talked to so many people who've been produced from that college who are so grateful to the United States for indirectly assisting with that. Why can't we have colleges like that throughout the tribal areas? Overnight it'll change. People will start thinking they're desperate for education. Health, medical facilities, roads, not necessarily strategic roads, but roads for market, irrigation schemes. Now those are the things that win you friends, win you hearts and minds. To get involved with providing security for them is a very slippery slope.
Well, I think the challenge there is that
Because we have only room for
Right.
4 more questions, so I wanted to give as
Yes,
many
yes,
people as-
yes.
Yeah, hi. In some of the tribal regions of Pakistan, there have recently been massacres of Shia Muslims, namely in Balochistan and in Gilgit-Baltistan. Are those massacres related to some of the problems you analyzed, or are those part of a larger problem in Pakistan as a whole?
So it's a very good question, and the question is the killing of the Shia sect in Pakistan. Again, if you understand the conceptual frame I was trying to present this afternoon, it's very simple. The answer is very simple. If you have a breakdown of law and order, everyone is at risk. I'm at risk. You're at risk. A Shia will be at double risk because the old animosities will surface. You'll have some neighbor saying, I don't like this man because he's a Shia. Wherever you have central authority weakening to the point that there's chaos in the land, you will then have old animosities surfacing. And then you have all kinds of excuses. There may be a neighbor who wants a cow or a piece of land or is jealous of the neighbor. He'll make up something about the neighbor. He'll say he's blaspheming against the Prophet, or he's a Shia, or he's not a proper Muslim. And before you know it, there's a riot and there's violence. Again, those are symptoms of weak government, of a chaotic law and order situation. The situation in Pakistan today, and I was talking to my friend Amin, until the law and order is secure, everything else takes second place. No investor wants to put money if people are being kidnapped and killed. And I admire the Pakistanis. Just think of what they're going through. Literally, for them, it's like 9/11 every day. And they're still carrying on. They're still having initiatives. They'll have peace, all these interfaith and peace initiatives. In spite of this, they're not losing heart. And the credit largely goes, and I want you to remember this name, largely goes to the founder of the nation, Mr. Jinnah. Mr. Jinnah for Pakistanis is like Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin rolled into one. He actually created the state of Pakistan with a whole team, but it was him and his vision. His vision was of a modern Muslim state, women's rights, minority rights, human rights. Now, he gave the vision. Pakistanis are still grappling with it. They haven't been able to live up to it. But here's your answer. When someone asked Jinnah, are you a Shia or are you a Sunni? Do you remember his answer? Jinnah said, he turned it around. He's a lawyer, so lawyers are always very clever. They answer a question with a question. He said, it was a big gathering like this, and someone from the back heckled him and said, first tell us, are you a Shia or Sunni? Meaning, if you're a Shia, we are not going to vote for you. So he said, I am exactly what the Prophet of Islam was. What was he, a Shia or Sunni? And there was no answer because it's like saying, was Jesus a Baptist or Presbyterian or Methodist? Jesus is Jesus. Joan said Presbyterian, of course.
Okay, we can take two more questions. You're the first woman who's asked a question, so most surely you get to do it. And you gentlemen are going to have to decide between the three of you which one gets to ask the question.
Well, we have three very distinguished gentlemen.
Let's turn to her first.
You mentioned the 1045 lecture this morning. Can you give your comments on the idea that the Pakistani identity is really built on this anti-American, anti-West ideal?
Well, I don't know who said that. If it is our friend Fareed Zakaria, I am a bit surprised because, on the contrary, I mentioned Mr. Jinnah. The founder. Mr. Jinnah had a choice. Pakistan has come into being 1947. It's the largest Muslim nation in the world. Pakistan has a choice of going to Moscow, the Soviet Union. They are wooing Pakistan. It's a new country, important country, and Washington. And what does Jinnah decide? He decides to go for Washington. And Pakistan, for the next half century, is solidly with the United States. Solidly. So I'm not sure how you can say Pakistan is either anti-West or anti-the United States. It doesn't make sense. Pakistan was a key unit of America's alliance called SEATO and CENTO, which stretched from Turkey down to Thailand. Pakistan was at the center of this. East Pakistan, West Pakistan. The idea of democracy, the idea of education, the idea of the founding fathers of Pakistan, of America and Pakistan, all these united the United States and Pakistan. So I would say that, on the contrary, if we are able to overcome this present rather turbulent phase, the United States and Pakistan are naturally allies, because Pakistan has never swung towards socialism, has never swung towards communism. It has always, up to the 80s, been very solidly pro-America. And in the Afghan war, when the Americans were siding with the Afghans against the Soviets, it was Pakistan who played an absolutely crucial role in bringing the Afghan war to a satisfactory conclusion. You may have seen Charlie Wilson's War, the movie with Tom Hanks. Now, you know, that symbolized a certain kind of America and the relationship where Pakistan and America were working very closely together. So that is my take on history.
Thank you.
Final question. Who won the lottery over here?
We couldn't resolve a lot.
You're going to do it? All right. Let me just ask you all a favor. We'll do one more question, and then we're going to take the ambassador over to sign his books. So if you would do me a favor, just let us get him through the crowd so that he can begin signing his books, and so you can have one of those books. All right, your turn.
I hope this question is not too far off your discussion, but what about the Haqqani network from the point of view of the tribal area? And can you tie it into the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence? And what can we do to make peace with this group?
Could you repeat that question? It's the last question, but a complicated one.
The Haqqani network.
Oh, Haqqani network. Yes. Sorry. Achha, he's translating it for me.
All right.
Yes, good question. And again, I'm going to give a complicated answer, so bear with me. Pakistan's interest is not the interest of the United States. India's interest is not the interest of the United States. Every nation, and I repeat this, every nation will promote its own national interest, right? Okay. Pakistan's interest is not to be surrounded by India. Pakistan is a small country. It is almost obsessed with the idea of this huge, aggressive, to Pakistanis, predatory neighbor called India. And now India has emerged as an economic power, political power, and full marks to India. And a democracy. So again, full marks to India. But to Pakistanis, India has troops all along the eastern border. The two have fought 3 wars. Both are nuclear. Now, if the Indians were to have troops and influence on the western border, it would completely surround Pakistan. So no general in the Pakistan army, no foreign secretary in Pakistan would ever want to be in a position where it's completely surrounded by a hostile neighbor. Therefore, Pakistan's interest will always be to have some influence in Afghanistan. The Haqqani group allows Pakistan to have some influence through that group, which in turn will give it influence when the deal is struck in Kabul, which is what's happening now. So Pakistanis will maintain that we cannot completely cut off from these tribes across the border, because with that we will be literally cutting our own feet. The American dilemma is to promote its own interest is to say you have to attack the Haqqani group in Waziristan in order to prevent them from coming across into Afghanistan. To which the Pakistanis reply that you can't stop them with 100,000 American troops with all the equipment you have. How do you expect us to stop them over here? Why can't you deal with them and prevent them coming here? So again, because there's so little trust between the allies, you have this back and forth. The ISI is involved because the ISI is a huge organization. It's not a tiny organization. It has states within itself. And there may be elements who are playing one game, some elements playing another game. It's very difficult for the government, especially a weak government, a shifting government, to be able to control it. It's the military. In Pakistan, the military is always sort of law unto itself. And the result is you have the chaos that you have today. And again, it's not in the interest of the United States or Pakistan or the tribal areas.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.